All right, so let's go ahead and jump on in. So let's talk about OneRoster 1.2, what status it's at, what status it is in, and what the timelines are looking like. So uh, OneRoster 1.2 is in what IMS refers to as candidate final status. Basically, what that means is that the technical solution is all but done, and we're in the process of having IMS member suppliers certify against the specification, and then in order to push it through the process, with the last step in the process being vote by tab members. We had initially planned to have it out a little bit earlier during 2020, but 2020 being what it was, we instead decided to shift focus slightly and just help the institutional members and the supplier members just get through back to school using OneRoster 1.2. So now we're looking at an early 2021 release for the finalization of OneRoster 1.2. And then just a quick note, if you're interested in being an early implementer and you're on the supplier side, you can reach out to me directly, jmcgee@imsglobal.org. All right, let's jump right in. I don't want to spend too much time. We only got a half hour here. So I'll handle this slide and then I'll hand it off to the next person in line. So OneRoster 1.2, just from a general perspective, kind of an umbrella level, brings a couple of major improvements. We've split the specification into 3 individual services, which we'll get to in detail a little bit further into the presentation. And this helps to it helps to simplify the workflow for suppliers and helps you to understand more easily what it is exactly that you're getting or what you're asking for. We've brought OneRoster sort of forward in the realm of security by bringing in OAuth 2.0 client credentials grant instead of using OAuth 1.0, which was what was used in 1.1. And then we've also improved the IMS toolset for testing and certification, not only just for in general OneRoster 1.2, but specifically around how we do bulk services. So your new migration, your new implementations, your new migrations to new clients, etc. All right, so let's keep on trucking here, and I'm going to hand it over to Matt Richards. I'll control the slide deck. You can just talk.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what rostering changes there are in 1.2 and how that improves OneRoster in general. The first one, and by far the biggest one in rostering, is improved role management. A big piece of pain in OneRoster 1.1 is when a certain user had multiple roles within an institution. A really common use case is a teacher who is also a parent, or a teacher, or maybe a principal at one school is a teacher at another school for a class or two, and they're a parent. They have all these various roles in different places. In the OneRoster 1.1 data model, you were kind of locked into one certain role in one certain organization. And so if you had these users that served multiple roles within the institution, they would be represented as separate users. And it'd be a really big pain point for consumers of the data to have to roll those together and cross-reference these various users. So OneRoster 1.2 introduced the concept of independent array of roles that can be assigned to an individual person. So you can see in the example here, Scott Summers is a teacher, a parent, and an administrator across different schools within that district. That's a really nice change for 1.2. Moving on to the next slide. Enhanced demographics. Introduce the concept of preferred names. This is to allow for the support of transmission of legal names as well as a student's preferred name in the classroom. There are many different use cases for OneRoster, some of them being strict reporting, some of them being day-to-day learning interoperability. So a student's preferred names can be sent along as well as their legal first and last name. Additionally, we've added unspecified and other as options for the sex enumerator, so that you don't have to send along a binary representation. And finally, improved identity management. This is something that came from the unique ID task force within IMS. The user model within OneRoster has added user master identifier. And this is an attempt to give a non-IMS specific unique identifier for a user. Now, this is something that is still evolving in its usage, but you can imagine this could be maybe a state ID that will follow a student all the way through their career in an individual institution or within a state. It also could be their federated ID from from a single sign-on system, something of that nature. But the point of it is it's a unique identifier that is not specific to the OneRoster implementation. It can follow them and have relevance even outside of IMS specifications.
So just to add to that, if you look at my cheeky little example here, we have Batman or Bruce Wayne as he goes by. He exists in all of these systems. He exists in the Batcave. He exists in the Gotham City Police Department and his Robin tracker, because who can keep track of who's Robin at any given time, right? And user master identifier allows you to assign the word Batman to all of those things in all of those systems. So you know that you're talking about the same person across these various sets. Okay, let's move on to talking about gradebook.
All right, so on the LMS side of things, the majority of requests we get are for integration enhancements to gradebook sync specifically. Districts are always looking for ways to reduce how much time their teachers spend manually managing two gradebooks. Especially, Josh alluded to COVID, everything is upside down right now. Anything we can do to save our teachers time is a huge win. For those of you who are using 1.1, OneRoster 1.1 in any sort of way, you know that helped bring our industry a lot closer to painless grade sync between two or more gradebooks. And the great thing about OneRoster 1.2 is it's removing additional pain points there and making it even easier and smoother and more accurate for our teachers to sync their grades and then not have to worry about going and manually reconciling them after the fact. So on the traditional side of grades, we have a handful of enhancements to 1.1 that we think teachers and their admins are going to love, starting with grading categories and category weighting. This now allows teachers to easily pull in the categories from their SIS or other system of record into their LMS or other tool they're using and automatically associate those with their materials. This way, when grades are ultimately sent back, there's no longer the need for that manual manipulation in a secondary system to go make sure everything is aligned and weighted properly. Additionally, score scales is another big feature that districts have been asking for and clamoring about. This removes the need for teachers to manage scales between the two systems. So same way with categories, you'll be able to pull them in and send scores back appropriately associated so that you just know your grade books in both places are accurately reflecting your student performance. Aside from traditional grades, which OneRoster 1.1, oh, Josh, do you have something to add?
No,
I
hit unmute by mistake. Sorry.
I was like, oh, go ahead, chime in.
I meant to mute myself to make sure I was muted to take a drink of water.
Okay. So aside from traditional grades, I think one of the most exciting parts of 1.2 is the association with CASE. For those of you who aren't familiar with CASE, it's an IMS standard and it defines how systems exchange and manage information about learning standards and competencies. If you couldn't tell, I read that because I couldn't quite memorize it. But it's an awesome specification that's going to make it easier for systems to communicate about learning standards in a way that we've never really been able to do before. For many of you on this call, especially if you're within organizations, within districts, you're painfully aware that managing your standards across multiple platforms, and specifically standard scores, becomes a huge time suck. It leads to human error. It's just a waste of time. And ultimately, your systems end up out of sync at some point. There's no way to keep them constantly together. The inclusion of CASE here opens the door for a passback of standard scores between systems, which should save our teachers a ton of time and make sure that the grades across all systems that they're using remain in sync. So with that exciting gradebook news, there's still more to talk about. So I'll pass it over to Scott to talk about assessment results.
Thanks, Britta. Assessments results profile, which once started as not really a part of 1.2, but now quickly is an important part of it. So assessment results profile is really about passing, assessment results that are not directly related to a classroom. So think your traditional, high stakes assessments, formative assessments, benchmark assessments, things that you wouldn't use the traditional gradebook that Britta just talked about for. So this is a new profile that is a part of a 1.2 gradebook, but separately certified that really passes assessment results. And the big part of it is it takes advantage of a hierarchical structure to be able to do this, so that each assessment vendor can really define the level of information that it's passing over, as well as the consumer of that can understand and be able to process that. So this is really about the outside of the classroom gradebook. And thanks, Josh. That's great. Really looking at this, and I like this diagram because it really shows how related it is to OneRoster and specifically gradebook, but yet it is a separate thing that has assessment line items and the hierarchical structure of it. One of the important ones is really being able to align that case performance, and part of an assessment line item can be at an item, at a domain, at a section, whatever the assessment vendor really is defining it is different case alignments as well as other ones, to really be able to pass over those results associated with that person rather than a class itself, because very seldom will these be associated with a class. With that, Josh, I'll turn to you to talk about resources.
Thank you. All right, so the third service that's available as part of OneRoster 1.2, and as a reminder, whereas in 1.1, it was all kind of part of one spec, resource is the third service. And the biggest change that we made there, again, thinking back to why we make these changes in the specifications, the driver are the use cases that are presented by you, right? Either the supplier member saying this is a huge integration pain point, or the institutional member saying we can't solve the problem we need to solve here, right? So the one that we heard about resources is that it was very limiting to only be able to assign a resource at a class level. My first grade class that I teach can only, that has 3 students in it, Matt, Britta, and Scott, gets assigned these great books. That's awesome. All of them are going to read those books. They're probably going to get something very useful out of it. But what if Matt might have individual instructional needs? There was not really a way to represent whatever resources were needed for those individualized instructional needs to a user under the 1.1 resource model. So we made the change, and we made it so that it now, in addition to being able to assign resources at a class level, which is still a very useful and valid use case, we also provided the ability to assign resources at an individual level for that individual instructional need. So as you can see in my little examples that I drew up here that I alluded to, my class with 3 students gets assigned one set of resources. In OneRoster 1.1 was the only way to go about that. In the 1.2 column, you can see that those same students get those same resources. And then in addition on the user, in the information we're transmitting about the user, Matt, he has additional resources assigned to him. So those are his resources that are used for individual instruction, because Matt really needed to learn a little bit about bananas, and he thought bananas were just for him. And he didn't want to share. So it was a lesson about sharing, obviously. So that's the improvements that was done to the resource service. I did want to take a quick moment and just touch on certification. Big thing that we always talk about kind of at every project, or sorry, every quarterly. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but the product directory is available to show you which of your suppliers and or which of your partners are certified for any given product. And you can use that as a way to make decisions about implementing specific tools. So did want to call that one out a little bit. All right, so there were a couple of questions in the chat. We'll stop here and start answering questions. Just did want to point out that I spoke much faster than I thought I was going to speak, and I thought it was going to be a little bit longer. But if you do have any questions that we don't cover on the call here, you can always feel free to reach out to me directly at jmcgee@imsglobal.org, or there's the OneRoster forums that you can always post on. So I'm going to start and go to some of the questions that were in the chat. There was one question that was actually raised by 2 separate members in regards to availability of the 1.2 specification for affiliate members. So in the next, I would say give 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to be posting the updated candidate final docs to the web page, which is different than having them posted in the forum or on the GitHub repo, and they will be available to contributing members and affiliate members at that point. That is the reason that that decision was made, was because of the delay in getting 1.2 out. We wanted to get that information and make it available to some members who are eager to use it. Next question that was in the chat was in regards to OneRoster 1.1 being deprecated. Right now, there is no timeline for 1.1 being deprecated. 1.0 was deprecated earlier this year, or maybe it was last year at this point. I don't recall specifically off the top of my head, but right now there is no 1.1 deprecation plan. There are plans, however, in regards to the deprecation of the security model. So for OAuth 1.0 being deprecated end of this year, I think is the last time we're accepting certifications using OAuth 1.0. I think I'm gonna have to double check on that though. All right, from Martin in the chat, for resources, the banana example, are they totally separate from the class resources, from the class course context, or is it more like for this class course, but only for this student? It could be either. There's no, it doesn't need to be one way or the other. In my example, it was in addition to for in that class for only that student. Sorry. So my example was like your second piece. Does anybody else have any other questions in the chat? Here we go. In 1.2, is there a way to set the academic session at a district level rather than at a school level and had an endpoint that returns it? I'll turn that question over to Matt.
We haven't had any major changes in the structure of the academic sessions as they relate to organizations, but as I think about it, I don't think there's any reason why that couldn't be made an implementation detail by the suppliers. Let me restate the question, make sure I understand. You want to be able to associate academic sessions at a district level that may or may not relate to the academic sessions at the school levels. Did I hear that right, Josh?
I'll reread the whole thing just so we can make sure. In 1.2, is there a way to set the academic session at a district level rather than at a school level and have an endpoint that returns it?
Well, we do have the academic sessions endpoint that will refer to specific organizations, and organizations in the OneRoster API could be a list of schools. It also could include the district itself. So I don't believe there's anything from a technical perspective that prevents that, but it would be an implementation detail by whoever is implementing the API, and I'm not sure how commonly that occurs. I'd be interested to hear more about the use case and what problems that would be solving, because that's something we could discuss in the OneRoster work group as far as a best practices guide edition.
There is no endpoint that returns it, actually.
There's no endpoint that returns academic sessions? Or maybe I'm understanding.
At a district level. The endpoints that you have is basically, it's all /school/ whatever, basically. Terms, essentially school ID terms, right? There's nothing that basically will allow you to specify. I understand organization is kind of fluid, like you could be a school, could be whatever, right? But which works great, but there is no endpoint, OneRoster endpoint basically that returns it where you can specify a district versus a school.
Sure. When we've done no changes with that in 1.2, so that may need to be something we discuss for a future edition, maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions from any participants in the call?
I guess, is anyone brave enough to guess as to when, I don't know, critical mass of suppliers will have adopted 1.2?
Well, I think there's going to be a little bit of a pinched hose effect right now with everybody dealing with massively changing backlogs because of the COVID crisis, and the fact that we're in the middle of a school year, and the fact that we're still in candidate final. We're not seeing the big flood. I anticipate by middle of summer this year, we're going to see a giant influx. But Josh, you've had your finger on the pulse of the individual suppliers much more than I have.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to state it. You know, the big hurdle is always the first few, and then the demand from the institutions that sort of go along with that. And the more that specifically the improvements to the rostering service, the more that that sort of propagates throughout the institutional membership here at IMS, the more we're likely to see, the initial suppliers get certified, which gets us over that candidate final hurdle. And then the institutions go to their suppliers and say, we want this because we also have this pain point and we want to solve for it. And that's kind of the typical way that it would happen. And at this time last year, or even earlier this year at similar meetings, we didn't have any suppliers through certification, and now we have started to get the ball rolling on that piece. There is another question in the chat. Has the consumer certification changed? There was talk back in February that it will be changing. That's a good question. Thank you for bringing that up. And the answer is yes. Consumer certification is actually changed pretty drastically from what it was in 1.1, with the sort of generalized way of stating it being you are now, as a consumer, only required to certify for at least one of the core set of endpoints for rostering. So whereas before I think there were 12 that you had to certify for in 1.1, in 1.2 it'll be at least one of the 22 core rostering endpoints. You have to do one. So I'll read this comment. It's not really a question, but it's a comment from Jim Severicus. Sorry if I butchered your name. And the comment being, I think that most vendors might be on 1.2 for back to school 2022. I think early adopters will be ready by 2021, but usually with roadmap alignments. Many vendors need 12 to 18 months planning and of course market pressure to align. Yeah, I think that's a good set of points. A number of the suppliers already have been working on it and either had to pause or just elongate out their roadmap that was devoted to doing the implementation. So I think that your sort of synopsis is correct, but maybe the timeline might be a little bit closer than that. Yes, John. So the question is, will the info about consumer certification be updated when 1.2 is made available on the website? Yes, the answer to that is yes. So when I post the new conformance, when I posted 1.2 docs, as I noted, which will make them available for members, the conformance and certification document will note that the certification has changed from X to Y. Will there be a separate validation tool for grade books? So do you mean will there be a separate validation tool for the assessment profile or just for the gradebook service? Both. Okay. So as a part of moving to 3 distinct services, you can now, test and certify for just gradebook as it is, and that is true. And then there will be a standalone certification validation tool for the assessment result profile piece. So you can do that one separate, or you can do gradebook by itself, including that. Any of our presenters, anything else that anybody wants to add? No? All right, I want to thank Britta, Scott, and Matt for being available and helping out here. And I want to thank everybody for attending. Remember, if you do have any other questions, I know that sometimes during these meetings, you're thinking about it, but you can't quite phrase your question or whatever. Feel free to reach out. I'll get you an answer as quickly as I can to that. And otherwise, thank you, everyone, and have a great day. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the IMS November quarterly meetings.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bye.
Monica, did you have something you wanted to